Hi everyone, my name is Charmaine Messer and I'll be showing you my final project for our class. My project's made to calculate a student's weighted grade for a class of their choosing. I wanted to make this program to help my fellow students find out what grade they needed to get on their final exam in order to get a certain letter grade, provided that they knew the information required, which is usually stated in the syllabus. I first made this program all in one .java file, which was not object-oriented at all, and that was a pain because I had to reorganize it. After I reorganized my code, I ran it a couple of times and realized that I didn't put any restrictions to what the user could input into the program, and I fixed that by putting while loops that would output an error message whenever the user tried to input something that wouldn't work. So I made 5 classes that consists of homework, tests, final test, class grade, and your final grade. Your final grade, which is this one, is where I put my main, where I'll be calling the methods that I created in the other class folders. I'm going to run my code and input my actual grades to show you how it works and the errors that we could encounter. So I'm going to go ahead and run. And down here on the interactions pane, it asks you what class would you like to calculate your grade in. I'm going to put in calculus. And then it's going to ask what is the weight of your homework, tests, and final exam out of 100. So our homework's worth 15%, our tests are worth 55%, and our final exam is worth 30%. So that adds up to 100. And how many homework assignments are there? I'm just going to put 2. What were the grades for your homework assignments? Homework number 1 points received out of 100. I got a 95 and a 90 for the second one. And then it asks how many tests are there. I had 3 tests. And then it asks for the grades that you received on the test. On the first test, I got a 90.5. Second one, I got a 95. And the third one, I've got an 85.7. Then it's going to ask finally what grade you received on your final exam, and in my case I got a 96, and there it outputs your final grade in the class calculus is 92.39%. So that means I got an A. Now I'm going to reset and run again and show you what happens when you input scores that are higher than 100. So again, I'm going to put in calculus for the class. Weight of the homework is 15, 55 for the test weight, and again 30 for the final exam. There was 2 homework assignments, and let's say, okay, it's asking how many homework, what were the grades for your homework assignments? Let's say I try to put in 200%. It's going to output incorrect input. Please enter a number less than 100 for your homework. So I'm going to go ahead and put 95. And if I do that again, it's going to say the same thing. And so those are the restrictions that I inputted so that you can't just enter any number. There was again 3 tests, and again if you try to put in 200 here, it's going to put out an error. So I'm just going to put 95, 90, and if I put in a different number again, incorrect input, please enter a number less than 100 for your test score. So I'm just going to put 85 and a 96. And that's pretty much what I did for my final coding project. As you can see, it calculates the total weighted grade. And that's pretty much it, ladies and gents. Thank you for watching and have a great